So yeah, just to put a bit more flesh on that introduction. In the last 12 months, I've exported vegetables to Canada, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, mainland China, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, UAE, and historically a lot of product up into Europe and Scandinavia. So we only handle vegetables. We're buying from farms, we're exporting our own product, and we're buying from farms in Victoria, Tasmania and Western Australia. So we've got a broad basis to this. What I'm going to talk about is the market, but then put hopefully a practical application of how these things succeed. So, how can we grow exports? Well, as we've already heard, there's a huge pull in the market going forward. There are a lot of consumers, in particular in Asia, who are wanting our product, and they've got more money to spend, they've got limited availability of land and water. And on top of that, we have support from the government, both federally and in the state now for exports. And AUSVEG and HIA have been very supportive in the last few years to generate the vegetable export market. But vegetable export growth, with the exception of carrots, and I will say that, carrot guys have been very successful, has really been slow. In particular, when you compare it with the way exports of citrus or fruit and nuts have really taken off in the last few years. So, why is this happening? I'm afraid that's the one. To me, we're not competitive in the world market. The carrot guys have been, but otherwise we're really not competitive, because the opportunity for the Asian market growing is being served by Europe, USA and South America as well. So they've got all those same credentials as we have. They've got sustainable production. They've got clean production. They can give them residue-free product. Although they have got higher freight costs and transit times, in many cases, to get into that market. But don't be put off by this, because we still can command a premium. I was in Singapore a month ago, and there was USA celery on the market in Singapore, in the supermarket, $1.50 a head. Australian alongside, and the Singapore market is extremely competitive in the supermarket levels, $3 a head, both being sold side by side. So, just because we don't have to always match the prices. But I will talk about how do we compare on price. And I'm talking about a global scale here. With vegetables, we really need to talk global. We've not got that counter-seasonal activity that the fruit guys have got. So I did a bit of benchmarking, and I took prices in Australia to retail level and New Zealand, and I took the UK as a comparative retail level to try to show where we sit in the pricing of what we're selling today within the country. These prices were taken in May, and I used the spot exchange rate at the time. 10% variance, just ignore that, that's not relevant. However, if you look along the top line, there we are, Australia, carrots $2.20 a kilo, UK $1.05. It's all converted back into Aussie dollar. Spuds $3, UK $1.05. Onions $2.90, $1.32. And it carries on. And those are the main export lines. So typically we are, in an Australian retail context, 2-3 times the price of a UK supermarket price. And that was a fairly high level UK supermarket, so that was Sainsbury's. That's not a discounter. The only one, if you notice, that's anywhere close is carrots. I just said carrots have been relatively successful in the world market. I know you're going to say things, oh, well, the UK market's got these differences. Well, true, and I will talk about a couple of those. So, transport. The Australian market's very spread. Yeah, true, with carrots, potatoes and onions. But you have to remember in the UK, those crops would have been harvested and in store for 7 or 8 months before they're packed. So there's some pretty hefty costs there for growers, whereas Australia's direct harvest straight into the market in May. Yeah. And the green products, so your broccolis, your cauliflowers, your iceberg lettuce, will all be coming from Spain or Morocco or other parts of North Africa, Egypt. So even if you take from the main growing area in Spain, which is probably the closest, the distance is something like the equivalent of Adelaide to Brisbane. So that's a fair way across Australia. They only got 20 pallet semis that they carted on. They don't have 30 pallet B doubles, so your prime mover's only doing 2/3 of the volume, and the driver. And the drivers are highly regulated with tachographs, remember. Diesel fuel, $2.35 a litre. It's probably nearer 2.60 today, actually, having just come back from there. You think of that in your little fuel surcharge that you get on the bottom of your transport bill from your haulier. You think at 2.60 a litre how much fuel surcharge you'd be getting. And they've got to get across the channel as well, so that's another direct cost. So a lot of those things, the transport costs would be pretty similar, if not a bit more in Europe. Subsidies, I know you all love your subsidies for European growers. You always say European growers all get all these subsidies. Well, they do. In the 1990s and the 2000s, the age of the Butter Mountain and the Wine Lake and everything else, they didn't include vegetables, so you got no subsidy on vegetables then from the Common Agricultural Policy, when it was all about growth. It changed in 2005 when the agri-environmental schemes were introduced, and vegetables were then included. There are multiple levels of payment, and the paperwork and the red tape is enormous, and you get checked out on it. They all involve environmental stewardship. So that would include things like restrictions on fertiliser use, restrictions on pesticide use. You can't spray your outside 6 metres of your paddock. Development of habitats, non-productive areas. So it's not money for nothing. The basic scheme, which the vegetable guys would probably be associated with, is worth about $400 a hectare a year. Not insignificant, I know. However, when you convert it back to that pricing at the bottom, that's less than 1 cent a kilo for carrots. We got over $1. Potatoes, it's 1 cent a kilo, and we had $2 difference in price. It's not actually very significant at all. So forget subsidies again. Australian supermarkets, the most profitable in the world. Woolies and Coles, of course. Remember, Aldi came here because they saw that, and they're being successful. True, but we'll look at some other food items. So same way it was done. Apples, $5 a kilo in Australia, $5.25 in the UK. Pretty similar. And the kiwis a bit less, and kiwis, of course, are very good apple exporters. Meat, cheaper in Australia. We export a lot of meat. Eggs, actually cheaper in Australia. And today, we're exporting eggs out of Australia. Milk, I could do the same, cheaper in Australia. So, do the supermarkets target vegetables for margin against other things, other food items? No, I doubt it. They make the margin everywhere. So, whilst the domestic prices are high, we don't compete on the export market terribly well because we're sheltered by this high domestic price. But it could change. And I think some growers have started to change. I know some growers have started to change. I say the carrot industry is being competitive. And now I'm going to talk about 3 areas I think you could focus on. The one I haven't talked about is labour with costs. And I'm only going to say labour. I'm turning the rest around and going to talk about its investment. I'm talking about the 3 I's. We've got the highest labour costs in the world, if we can find any workers, that is, of course. Basic casual labour, you should be paying somebody in $28, $30 an hour. The UK cost is equivalent is about $18 to $20 an hour. The headline figure is only probably $13, but by the time you pay them all overtime, which you have to pay at the weekends and after 38 hours, by the time you've paid holiday payments, etc., it's still $10 an hour or a third less. But then you go and look in the UK, you go and look across Europe, you go and look across the US, and the number of labour units per unit of vegetable production in Australia is very high. In other words, in those other countries, you will find big automated packing sheds. You will find automated harvesting rigs. The number of people they were employing as harvesting, as packing, is a lot less than it is here. Despite the fact the labour costs, and I could do South America's a lot lower labour costs, but you look at the packing facilities in South America. Investment must be a priority to reduce the labour component, individually and collectively, and we heard David said this morning about collectively, and I think that's the key. We can't necessarily go it alone, we have to do it collectively or collaboratively, because you can't do it as an individual. Try to get some of this labour cost out of the system. Inputs, I'll talk about these. Look at direct machinery and purchases from overseas. I've done it, not very difficult. Do it on the internet. If you go and do major items, do go and look at them though before you get them here. And just make sure you've got enough lead time. Input costs are high, investigate sourcing options. Now, we do this. We pack asparagus in wooden and plastic boxes. 2 years ago, we sourced them all locally in Australia. Over the last 2 years, a rapid transit to import, and this year we'll only source a few from Australia manufacturer because actually they're a disabled employer and the business would like to support that business. However, we're now importing them all direct from China. We have done a lot of work on it, but we've got a saving between $1 and $2 a box, and we buy over 300,000 boxes a year. So you think about that saving. And we also source boxes from some of our growers for their domestic business. Gives us volume to source, and they win as well. So they're piggybacking on the back of our success. And yes, we charge them a small amount extra for doing it, but it's not that much. Keeps them happy, keeps them in business. Last one I want to talk about is innovation. And there were some comments about the supply chain and logistics. We do logistics, both air freight and sea freight. And I'm going to use broccoli as an example. Traditionally, it went from Melbourne or Brisbane by air freight in an 8 kilo styro box plus ice, and some out of Sydney, but you've got to road freight it from Melbourne or Brisbane to get it to Sydney. So if we take a Singapore buy price of $24 for an 8 kilo landed, as an example, I'm using an example, $3 a kilo, we get something like this. So if we look on for start, air freight and styro, Brisbane, Melbourne, takes 3 days. Freight cost is $1 a kilo, approximately. So from your $3 a kilo selling price, you've got a grower return of $2. However, you can do it by sea, bit cheaper freight cost, get a better grower return, but 18 days of transit, by the time you've loaded it on the farm, got it off at the other end, is high risk to me. If you pack it in a cardboard box, which some people are trying to do, you can get a few more in the container, so your shipping cost comes down, and you can also palletise it, because a styro box don't fit on a container, on a pallet that goes in a container. But if you go to a cardboard box, you can get on a pallet, and that makes life a lot simpler. So you get a bit more cost, but you still, your freight time's the same. It is better, it bleeds some of the water out. Another way of looking at it is to use that same cardboard box and put it out of Fremantle. Now, immediately, you WA guys, you've got down the transit days to 8. Now, with beginning to talk about interesting from sea freight, and the cost out of Fremantle's less. So we've got up to $2.75. The last one, nobody's doing at the moment, but that's how they pack it in Spain for the UK. Overwrapped with a shrink wrap pack, dry in a box. You get a lot of weight in the box. Cheap to do it. You've gone up to $2.80 grower return. I've improved the grower returns by 40% by adjusting the packaging type. That's a big number. So to conclude, we've got a massive vegetable export market opportunity. When the price is reduced a little bit, the volumes will grow. And I want to see the Australian market grow in volume and size and security. And that's what the export market can give us. Whilst there are some excuses for a high cost base, by some of those examples of investment in input cost adjustment and innovation, we can reduce costs significantly, and producers will go after the export market. The ones that do will increase in size and invest and reduce the cost of production further, gain volume, and it goes back round in a circle. And they will be more and more successful. And that's how I believe we can grow the market to benefit the industry.